America is a land of great museums, and every museum has spellbinding stories to tell.
The Dalmatian was a coach dog, and it had the ability to run under the horse's legs, nip at their heels to make them run harder.
My perception of firemen has remained exactly the same since the time I was about 3 or 4 years old. This museum means a great deal to me.
Trial by Fire, the New York City Fire Museum. Next on Great Museums. Major funding for great museums is provided by the Eureka Foundation, dedicated to the educational power of television and new media. Exercise your curiosity. Explore America's great museums.
Fire to me, it might sound crazy, but the first thing that comes to my mind is excitement. You know, I find it exciting.
I think of the Red Devil. The devil that we have to fight every day, the devil that's confronting us, and the devil we beat. Okay, but he's the Red Devil. He can hurt us.
So you got to be strong. You got to be smart. You know, you have to be able to think on your feet and think fast.
I think firefighters now will always be regarded as almost superheroes, larger than life.
Where else can you be brave in a time of peace?
I think all firefighters are brave. You can't do this. You can't walk into a fire, organize yourself to do it, manage your fear to do it, and not be a brave man.
In New York, they're known as the bravest. They've been fighting the city's fires and rescuing its citizens for 350 years. They've used everything from leather buckets to high-powered hoses. At the same time, they've taken tremendous pride in their equipment, polishing it, decorating it, and showing it off in parades. That long and glorious history is told in an old firehouse in Lower Manhattan at the New York City Fire Museum.
Firefighters are a critical part of people's lives. Sometimes people don't realize it, but they're keeping us all safe, and they have cool toys.
Some of the equipment here and the stories here and the traditions here are the greatest you're going to find in any fire department in the world. So it certainly should be preserved here in New York City.
I think when you come to our museum, it isn't just a history of firefighting. It's intertwined with the whole history of New York City.
To me, this is a very, very special place, and it captures the history of, and I don't think I offend anyone when I say this, but what truly is the greatest fire department in the world.
Our first firefighting equipment in New York was in 1657 when Peter Stuyvesant was the governor of New Amsterdam. He had a fire that burned down 310 homes. And so he passed a law that said every family, every business will have 2 leather fire buckets.
And it shows you how basic firefighting was in the early days of New York City, when they had the women and children and volunteers of every size and shape and age that would just pass water buckets along. They'd fill up the bucket and they'd pass it along this long line and throw it on the fire.
In the beginning, firefighters were all volunteers. Everyone pitched in when the alarm was sounded.
Peter Stuyvesant, the governor of New Amsterdam, found he was having fires at night, and so he hired 8 men to roam the city, and if they saw a fire, they would sound their rattles. They were called Rattle Men.
The Rattle Men and the Bucket Brigade were the mainstay of firefighting for over 100 years. They were still in use during the Revolutionary War when British troops burned the city. But within a few years, New York got its first fire engines.
That is reported to have been pulled in the parade for the inauguration of George Washington. That's why we call it the Washington engine. It's our smallest and oldest piece. Hand-pulled, hand-pumped. And now we have leather hose, and we can actually shoot water at the fire. 8 men have to pump it, and probably about 20 to 30 pulled it.
With the arrival of fire engines, the first fire companies were formed. Initially, volunteers came from the ranks of wealthy property owners who stood to lose the most in a fire. George Washington was one. His portrait was painted on the back panel of an early hand pumper. But increasingly, it was the working classes who joined, willing to put their lives on the line, but also hoping to move up the social ladder.
The volunteer companies, and there were many of them in New York, were basically a social organization.
And some of these clubs were also political clubs. The foreman of the company would have some stature, and he'd be dealing with the city, and it was a sort of a way for them to get into politics. 7 firefighters went on to become mayors, using the fire department as their initial political base.
Rivalries soon sprang up between the fire companies.
Initially, it started as a sort of good-natured who could get to the fire first, but then they began battling over hydrants, who could get to the water first.
Some of the companies were supported by insurance firms who put their marks on insured buildings.
If they were subsidized by the insurance company, and 2 of the companies showed up at the same time who were subsidized by them, they would have pitched battles in the street for the privilege of putting first water on your house. It's a wonder that fires were ever put out in those days.
Cartoons of the day ridiculed these failings. Ultimately, they would spell the end for the volunteer fire department. But not all the rivalry was bad. Firefighters continued to save lives and property, and they put on dazzling parades.
One company wants to show, particularly in the volunteer period, that their rig looks prettier or more ornate or better painted or more gilded than their neighbor's apparatus.
It's from Astoria in Queens, where the Steinway Piano Company is. And it is a beautiful hose wagon, and it used to pull rolled up hose, leather hose, and it is magnificent. It is made of brass and copper and etched glass, and you could see the pride that the volunteer firefighters took in pulling their apparatus in parades.
Firefighters are entitled for us to feel about them the way we felt about them as children. You know, very often when you're a child, you have romanticized notions of heroes. You hero worship ball players, or you hero worship actors, or whatever your inclination is. And then it usually turns out that you overdid it. In the case of firefighters, you haven't overdone it.
They were proud of what they were doing. Here we go, we're walking up the street and everybody can see us, and we're the volunteers. We're the guys who put out the fire, save your life.
In 1835, a devastating fire burned down much of the city. During this time, New York firefighters acquired one of their most enduring symbols.
This is a standard New York City fire helmet. It's called a New Yorker. It hasn't changed its shape in over 150 years. It's got a high crown. This is to absorb any shock of ceilings falling on your head or any objects falling on your head. It has a long back. This is to stop the hot water from going down your neck. The water runs off here. In an emergency, if you don't have a mask on and it's very hot, you can turn the helmet around, and this will stop your face from being burned. So it's got multiple uses.
Unlike other places where, like say Philadelphia, the hat looks more like a top hat, in New York, the hat is purely functional. From the 1800s to today, the helmet really hasn't changed dramatically. Materials changed a little bit. They're not leather so much now. They're composite materials. They've added a eye shield. But more or less, it's the same helmet.
But even with better equipment, firemen still died. In 1845, during one of New York's worst blazes, a firefighter named Augustus Cowdery entered a factory filled with explosive chemicals.
He was a promising lawyer. He was a firefighter trained to be a lawyer, and he just blew up and disappeared.
This monument was made in his honor, the victim of a fire that decimated Lower Manhattan. But even one death is too many. The fires of the new industrial age sounded a wake-up call to city officials. The nation's leading commercial center needed a professional firefighting department.
I think the reason why the New York Fire Department is as good as it is experience and tradition. It's this is America's largest city by a lot. It's America's most complex city.
To handle its growing complexity, New York also needed state-of-the-art technology.
We became a paid department in 1865, and we had steamers. And those steamers were pulled by 3 magnificent horses. And now, all of a sudden, we didn't have 10,000 firemen in New York because they were all volunteers. We had 800, and they were doing the same job.
And they were soon doing a better job. Firefighters were required to wear uniforms and were properly trained. Many of the basic functions of the modern fire department were introduced. Ladder companies were responsible for doing search and rescue. Engine companies put out the fire. Their main tool was a gleaming brass steamer.
It was the key firefighting equipment, at least in terms of pumping water. The piece we have in the museum is about 1900 and was used in Brooklyn. It's a marvel of technology. Modern fire engines can pump a little bit more than that one could, but it could make a good show of itself even today in terms of how many gallons per minute it could pump.
The horses were the best New York City could buy. They had to be given names. They could not be called numbers. They were given the best food. They saw a veterinarian every 3 months. The first ambulance in the New York City Fire Department was made for horses, not for firefighters.
Edward Croker, one of the fire department's most famous chiefs, also used a horse-drawn buggy to get him to fires.
When that steamer responded, they had a man in the front. He was the driver. He took care of the horses. And they had a man in the back who was the stoker, who would build up a fire inside the chimney of that steamer to get the water boiling in there, and that was the pumping pressure. The rest of the firemen ran to the fire.
Tragically, the first fireman to die in the line of duty during the paid era was trampled to death by his horses. And the horse was not the only animal used to fight fires.
The Dalmatian, the spotted white dog that we all know, was a coach dog, and it had the ability to run under the horse's legs, nip at their heels to make them run faster, run harder.
But their main role would be to sit with the horses at the fire. When the horses got to the fire, the horses would be taken off the steamers or other apparatus, and the dogs would sort of protect the horses from other stray dogs, from kids, from anyone bothering them.
They were also very loyal to firefighters. Horses and steamers proved such an effective combination that they were used to fight fires for more than 60 years. Not until Christmas 1922 did the last horse-drawn engine in Brooklyn make its final run. At the dawn of the new century, New York's fire department faced new challenges. Soaring buildings meant riskier fires.
I think all New Yorkers have a real respect for firemen. I mean, because I think, this is a tough city, and a city filled with skyscrapers, and we all have seen fires in the high rises. You don't have to be a great expert or aficionado of firefighting to imagine the terror of fighting a fire on the 30th or 40th floor.
This is a pompier ladder, a scaling ladder. This ladder was carried on every fire engine in New York from 1870 up until about the 1980s. The way this ladder works is simply this. If your area ladder only goes to the 4th floor, but you have victims on the 6th floor, you carry this ladder to the 4th floor, you sit on the windowsill, and you run the ladder up the wall to the 5th floor, turn that hook in, pull it down, then you climb this ladder to the 5th floor, and you repeat that from the 5th floor to the 6th floor.
But for the 146 young women sewing blouses in a garment factory, the ladders would arrive too late. It was March 25, 1911, shortly before quitting time at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company.
In this case, it was a sweatshop, and because of union activity or trying to keep union activity off the floor, some of the doors were locked. So when the fire started, over 140 people died in that fire because they couldn't get out.
All of the laws, child labor laws were changed, building construction laws were changed, fire prevention codes were instituted.
One of the fire crews to respond to the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire drove a new gas-powered engine. But since the internal combustion motor was still untested, the fire department preferred to keep the reliable steam engine in the back to pump water.
Because firefighters put their life on the line all the time, new technology is always taken sort of warily, because if it doesn't work, lives could be lost.
The alarm box was also very reliable.
I grew up in New York City. I grew up in Alphabet City in Manhattan. I think the first time I walked into the Fire Museum and I saw the old alarm boxes. I remember the one that used to be on the corner of 9th Street and Avenue C, and it brought back a flood of memories.
If people saw a fire, they would come to this box, open it, and pull down the handle. Within seconds, the companies that were affected by this number, 2451, would get that in this firehouse in Morse code, and they would respond.
But even when technology is reliable, firefighters still risk losing their lives every day. What makes them do it?
I think the guys really love it because it means something. Nobody gets rich in the fire department or in the fire service in general. But there's such great spirit and camaraderie between the men themselves.
In many cases, they do it because they saw the kind of lives their fathers led, and that their fathers came home happy. And they liked that mood and humor and warmth of the firehouse. I think that's much more important than the idea of being a hero. I think they would tiptoe around that word a little bit. They would be made nervous by one of their brethren, and they do think of each other as brothers, beginning to talk about being a hero.
But for the rest of us, it's not hard to see firefighters as heroes.
My perception of firemen has remained exactly the same since the time I was about 3 or 4 years old. My uncle was a New York City fireman. He worked in a ladder company. He was driving the back of the ladder, and he was knocked off it and thrown on the ground. Well, he went back to his career in the fire department, became a lieutenant, a captain, was decorated many times, injured seriously one more time. So he's one of my childhood heroes.
Yet even in the fire department, there are some unlikely heroes.
Chief, who's a little fire dog, who was adopted by Engine Company 203 back in the 1920s. He's a little hero. He's actually even saved cats and kittens, even though he didn't particularly like them.
This dog must have been a firefighter in an earlier life or something, because it wanted to do this and become beloved by the firefighters, and it's why when it finally met its demise, they had it mounted, and it's been on display ever since.
To keep pace with the rapidly evolving demands of the world's largest city, New York firefighters have constantly had to adapt to new vehicles and new technologies. And their numbers have increased too. By the 1950s, the New York Fire Department had grown to 10,000 strong, the same number as in the volunteer days. And from the moment they begin training, firefighters must master an arsenal of tools aimed at saving lives.
One tool called a Halligan Tool, which is a combination of 3 tools, sort of like a pickaxe, a crowbar, and an adze, which is great for opening doors, but now they have these pneumatic tools which can pop open doors even faster, and the faster a firefighter can get into a building, the faster they can put it out and rescue people.
They have a great safety net down on the first floor also. It's something that we don't use anymore, but they were using it when I came on the job. We had to go up on top of a garage and jump into this safety net with about 8 or 10 guys holding onto it.
But sometimes a simple rescue rope is still the best and only way to save a life. In May 1991, that became dramatically clear.
It's hard to see how they put their life on in a building on fire because it's dark and there's no photographers. So one of the nice things about this is that, you can clearly see what you're doing. What the picture is a firefighter on a rope, going down a building, carrying someone who was just rescued, who's now hanging on for dear life. And on the roof, there are several firefighters helping direct and holding on to the rope.
You know, it depicts two of the greatest people that I've ever known in this department. One was Kevin Shea, who was just a super firefighter, who had to finally retire because of all his broken bones, and he was hurt in the original explosion at the World Trade Center. Just a wonderful man. But the other person was Captain Patty Brown, one of the men that I think took heroism past what normal heroes do.
Captain Patty Brown was one of 343 firefighters killed in the worst fire New York City has ever known. On September 11, 2001, he went into one of the Twin Towers at the World Trade Center.
I think that people come into this museum now with a whole new respect for what firefighters do. I think everyone knew before September 11 that the job was dangerous. I think September 11 just really drove that home.
Now everybody realizes that there were 343 men who were heroes, who went into a burning building, and I was down there, and they went into the burning building and they looked up and they said, gee, I don't think I'm going to come out of this. And they didn't come out. A lot didn't come out.
Increasingly, we have donations and artifacts and paintings relating to the World Trade Center disaster. And we have to put it in because it's so important to the story. It affected so many people's lives.
We actually had a gentleman a few weeks ago did a to-scale model of the Twin Towers, originally done for one of the ladder companies.
Behind the model, crosses have been cut in a piece of steel, salvaged from the World Trade Center.
We have a flag made up of toy fire trucks and police cars, making the red and white and blue stripes. Then they're really touching pieces of things which have come in from Ground Zero itself. Damaged equipment which no one's ever quite seen damage like that before. And sometimes those simple things like that say a lot, give people pause.
Well, that's the lasting image of that day, of people leaving the buildings and getting out as quickly as they could, and the firemen going in. I mean, I think it's a very special kind of job. It takes a very special kind of person to do it.
When I was standing in the lobby of the North Tower and Chief Downey said to me, after the South Tower was hit, Chief Downey to me was probably the most knowledgeable expert in collapse in the fire service in the world. And he said to me, these buildings can come down. But there was no urgency in his voice. There wasn't, boss, we got to get everybody out of here. These buildings coming down in 5 minutes.
When I arrived at the fire department command post, which was after the two buildings had been attacked, but before either one of them came down, and I asked Chief Gansey if we could get helicopters up to the top of the building. And he looked at me, and he said to me, our guys can save everybody below the fire. And I knew, when he said that to me, that he was saying to me, Mayor, we can't save the people above the fire. And if we try to do it, we're going to kill a lot of people. Chief Gansey, Bill Feehan, Ray Downey, the people who ran this operation, took advantage of every second God gave them and just saved thousands and thousands of people. I saw them maybe 15, 20 minutes before they died, and it'll be with me forever.
September 11th was something that no fire department could possibly ever been able to handle. We did the best we could. I've always felt that we've won every battle we've ever been in. We may have had casualties, but we won every battle, and I felt that we lost September 11th.
But even in the shattered, white-hot ruins of the World Trade Center, the character and determination that has been built and nurtured over generations prevailed.
And then for me, it all gets symbolized in the flag that the three firefighters raised at Ground Zero at a time in which the fires were 2,500 degrees and they could have easily collapsed or had something hit them. And it didn't stop the New York City firefighters. They raised a flag the way the Marines did at Iwo Jima, basically saying, America's still here and we're stronger than you are.
From the volunteer days to the present, firefighters have played a proud and prominent role in New York City. From leather buckets and wooden rattles has grown the premier firefighting department in the world. They are the bravest, and they've amassed a legacy to prove it. It's a history that they proudly display at the New York City Fire Museum.
This museum means a great deal to me. A Firefighters Museum means a great deal to me on all different levels.
I mean, for the firefighters themselves, they have a very proud history. And I think that it's a history which ought not to be forgotten.
The rescue shirt.
We have wonderful volunteers here who are retired firefighters who just have incredible stories that I think I could listen to over and over and over again.
When you're a fireman, you never forget what you were and what you can do. So I walk in here every day with a sense of pride and accomplishment that I'm still part of the department.
Great Museums collection is available on DVD or VHS. To order this episode or another, call 1-800-593-4420 or visit greatmuseums.org. Learn more about the Year of the Museum and the American Association of Museums at greatmuseums.org. America's Great Museums, their stories are our stories. Major funding for Great Museums is provided by the Eureka Foundation, dedicated to the educational power of television and new media. Exercise your curiosity. Explore America's great museums.